Some of the great philosophers have also been great writers in the sense of literary artists. I suppose the outstanding examples are Plato, St. Augustine, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And if not quite in their class, Descartes, Pascal, Berkeley, Hume, Rousseau were certainly very good writers anyway. And in our own time, Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre have both been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. But on the other hand, some great philosophers have been bad writers, two of the very greatest, Kant and Aristotle, being two of the worst. Quite a few are just pedestrian. One thinks, for instance, of Aquinas or Locke. As for Hegel, his work has become a byword for obscurity, almost a joke in this respect. He must be the most difficult to read of all world-famous writers. What these examples show is that philosophy as such is not a branch of literature. If a philosopher writes well, it's little more than a bonus. It makes him more enticing to study, obviously, but it does nothing to make him a better philosopher. A philosopher can be in the very highest rank of all, like Kant, and still be a lousy writer. I state this firmly at the outset because in this programme we're going to consider some of the areas where philosophy and literature do overlap, not only in the work of philosophers who happen to be great writers, but also in the work of other kinds of writer, poets, playwrights, novelists, who have been directly influenced by philosophical ideas. We have someone here whose experience spans both these worlds. Iris Murdoch is now a novelist of international reputation, but for many years before she became a successful novelist, and indeed for some years after, she was a tutor in philosophy at Oxford University. Iris Murdoch, when you're writing a novel on the one hand and philosophy on the other, are you actually conscious that you're engaged in two radically different kinds of writing? Are you conscious that you're writing differently?
Oh, very much so, yes. These two branches of thought have such different aims and such different styles, and I feel very strongly that one should keep them apart from each other. I mean, that is that when one's writing philosophy, one's writing something which is very much more like science in a way than it's like literature. And literature, of course, has its own rules and its own tricks, and philosophy aims to clarify. In fact, it's essential to philosophy that should be, in some sense, clarification, and literature is very often mystification, and besides, literature is for fun, literature entertains, literature does many, many things, and philosophy does one thing.
It seems to me, having read many of your books, including your philosophical books, that the actual sentences themselves are different. I mean, what strikes me if I read one of your novels, the sentences are, so to speak, opaque in the sense that there's a lot in them. There's a heavy cargo. There's lots of connotation and allusion and ambiguity and so on. Whereas in your philosophical writing, the sentences are translucent. They're only saying one thing at a time.
Yes, well, I hope this is so, yes. I mean, if obviously one has a style as a writer, and I certainly have a probably recognisable style as a novelist, but my philosophical style would be something totally different, and I would be very pleased if it was impossible to tell it was the same person writing.
You said something a moment ago that interested me very much. You said that philosophy, I think I remembered your words correctly, you said philosophy, the aim of philosophy is to clarify, and the aim of literature is to mystify. And I suppose it's central to what the novelist or the playwright is doing, that he's actually trying to create an illusion, whereas it's central to what the philosopher is doing, that he's trying to dispel illusion or pierce through illusion or liberate his and our minds from illusion. Is that an essential part of the difference?
Yes, certainly. And philosophy is to do with getting hold of a problem and holding on to it relentlessly and doggedly. And this is the mark of a philosophical mind, this particular relentlessness, the fact that you stick to your problem.
Yeah. With the making of the contrast in mind, let's deal with these one at a time. I mean, how would you characterise literature as distinct from philosophy in this context?
Well, I don't think one can offer exactly a definition of literature, nor is it necessary in place here.
We know some of the characteristics.
We know what literature is. It's an art form using words, and I would say that literature is art by definition, and the point at which I mean, one could define it by contrasting it with, say, journalism or something. I dare say great journalism is literature, but there are all sorts of borderlines here. And literature is very, very various. And one thing that strikes one, of course, is that philosophy is very tiny. If you think how small European philosophy is, and
but just the small body of work.
Yes, I mean, it's not a vast and multifarious area.
No.
What strikes one very much, I think, is the way in which the problems which were stated at the beginning are still there, which some people might regard as proof that one is not making much progress.
Well, the philosopher Whitehead once characterised this rather strikingly, didn't he, by saying that all Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato.
Yes.
And there's a sense in which that is true. I mean, Plato mapped out the territory, and we've all been working in it ever since.
I think the more one studies Plato, the more one sees that this is true, that he raised practically every problem and raised it in a very sophisticated way. Well, literature is vast and multifarious and multiform. It's not, of course, entirely to do with fictions. I mean, there are kinds of literature which aren't fiction, but
historical writing and essays,
reflections of all kinds.
Yes.
But typical literature, as it were, I mean, is stories and poems and so on, is fictional. It is to do partly with playing roles. That this is true to some extent of poetry, and I suppose entirely, almost entirely, perhaps one should say, true of the novel, that it's to do with masks and roles and pretending and imagining in that sense, and storytelling. And in this sense, I think literature is very natural. It's very close to ordinary life, and it's.
Well, we all tell stories.
We all tell stories. Yes,
I
think
of our ordinary lives.
This is the most natural thing in the world.
Yes.
Telling stories. I mean, one is doing it all the time, possibly without noticing it. If one describes one's day, as it were, one is shaping one's material into a story form. Very often, it's a funny story, incidentally, which I think is a very important fact.
Yes, there aren't many jokes in philosophy.
No, there are witticisms,
yes.
But not exactly jokes. Yeah, I think jokes would be out of place.
Yes.
And but somehow we live in a literary atmosphere. I mean, we live and breathe literature to some extent, in that when we tell stories or when we write letters and so on, we are making a form out of something which might be formless. And this is one of course, the deep motives for literature or for art of any sort, that one is defeating the formlessness of the world.
One is imposing order on one's
Yes, one is cheering oneself up
environment.
And consoling oneself, and also, of course, instructing oneself by giving a form to something which is perhaps alarmingly formless in its original condition, a sort of rubble, as if we lived in a kind of rubble world, and one's always making forms.
Yes. When you say one's cheering oneself up, I mean, that brings to the fore the fact that one of the essential aims of literature has always been to entertain, hasn't it?
Yes.
And I don't think that has anything whatever to do with the motive of philosophy.
No. I think it may be that philosophy also cheers us up, of course, because philosophy is the imposition of form on the formless in a vast way. But I think this is something which, insofar as the philosopher might be aware of this, it's something that he would be suspicious of in himself, because one's temptation to produce a hasty form or an inappropriate form in order to console oneself. This temptation is one that the philosopher, of course, has to avoid, and I think the good philosopher is always undoing his own work. This is part of the holding on to the problem, being dogged and relentless, which would also, of course, militate against certain kinds of literary devices, because it means that one has to repeat oneself, that philosophy is repetitive, it's coming back over the same ground and breaking the form that you've made. And
you've made a number of points here, especially in your characterization of literature, which by implication contrast with philosophy, but I'd like now to, as it were, draw out the contrasts explicitly. For example, you said just now that, and I think it's a striking fact about storytelling, you said that it's natural and that we all do it and it's part of everyday life, and certainly we all like being told stories. Whereas I suppose by contrast, philosophy is, as it were, counter-natural. I mean, philosophy involves essentially the critical analysis of one's beliefs and the presuppositions of one's beliefs, And it's very striking that people actually don't like having that done to them. None of us do. We don't like being analysed, and we don't like the assumptions on which our beliefs rest being questioned, because it makes us feel insecure and uncomfortable, and we all have a strong resistance to doing it.